Hello, and welcome to our continuing series of Better Business interviews. Better businesses are those that are driven by purpose to use business as a force for good, for positive change, for people and planet. Throughout this series, we are chatting with key people in these organisations and finding out why they do what they do. This week, I've been joined by Steffen Boehm from the University of Exeter. Now, the University of Exeter is a public research university based in the southwest of England. A member of the Russell Group of universities, it has the motto, Lucem Sequima, we follow the light, which I thought was quite nice, sets the tone. Alumni include Sajid Javid, who is currently the UK Secretary of State for Health and Social Care at recording, but more importantly, J.K. Rowling. Steffen is a professor in organisation and sustainability at the University of Exeter's Business School. Prior to joining Exeter 5 years ago, Steffen has held various positions with universities in Sweden, Scotland, Austria, Denmark, and Brazil. There might be others. And as if that wasn't enough, he's also co-founder and co-editor of the open access publishing press MayFlyBooks. With credentials like those, we need to hear what he's passionate about. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Russell. Nice to be here.
So I like to ask an elephant in the room question, which is sometimes a little bit glib, but in this particular case, it's a bit tricky. I'd like to know, what is sustainability? How would you define sustainability?
That's a big question to ease me into the conversation. Thanks very much.
That's right. You're welcome.
It's a big one because it potentially encompasses everything. So the way I normally approach sustainability is through what is sometimes called the triple bottom line approach.
Yeah.
So it's got an economic dimension, it's got a social dimension, and it's got an ecological or environmental dimension.
Yeah.
The environmental dimension we can sort of define by what are called the planetary boundaries. I don't know whether you've heard of that. It's basically research coming out of Sweden originally, from more than 10 years ago now, where scientists have kind of defined, what's the ecological safe operating system the planet can operate in, right?
Yeah. So,
what's a healthy ecosystem from a planetary perspective? So biodiversity, healthy water, seas, healthy air, the ozone layer, the water cycles, the carbon cycles, the phosphate and nitrogen cycles, all of this is describing the health, the ecological health of the planet. Mm. And if we tinker with these cycles, then all sorts of things are happening, and we're reaching tipping points now in a variety of these areas where, we don't know, we are entering uncharted territory. We don't know what's going to happen afterwards, right? The social aspect is well described with the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. So there are many of these goals which define basically the safe operating principles, if you like, in the societal sphere. So things like, everybody should have a livelihood, work, clean water, access to food, etc., etc. So these are the social aspects. Mm-hmm. And then the economic aspects are important as well, because we all need to make a living. Livelihood is important, and we to be fully human, as it were, we need to have an economic base and economic stability. So these three aspects, for me, if they work in harmony with each other, should describe a sustainable system. Is that good enough for you?
I think that's great. I mean, obviously the triple bottom line and is very, very popular with the B Corp environment, that I'm familiar with, because our business is a B Corp as well. So yeah, that sits nicely, and I like the alliterative people, planet, and prosperity over profit. But I get your point. We can't live without that money system as it stands. If it wasn't money, it'd be bartering. That would just be a different type of economics. I mean, on that point, and and kind of crossing over into the business area, that profit bit, that prosperity bit, there's an undertow of some of the things you've written and others have written, that capitalism's kind of broken. Is that the way you see it? Do you think we're sitting on the edge of a new form of economics that's facing us?
Well, I think there's no doubt that capitalism in its current business as usual way is completely broken. We just need to look at these three, triple bottom line dimensions that I mentioned. In all of these three things, the system that we've invented, and in historical terms, this is it's been 250 odd years. During that time we've been talking about capitalism. It's the blink of an eye, historically speaking. It's a very, very new system that we, the collective we, have invented, and in this country, in the UK in particular. So unfortunately, on in these three dimensions, there's so much evidence out there that the current system that we call capitalism has found its limits, and the way we produce food is not sustainable. The way we run societies is not sustainable, and the way we run our economies is not sustainable. And on a daily basis, we can see in all of these domains so many not just problems, but grave injustices and emergencies where one really needs to rethink what economic and social system one wants to live in. And I think we urgently need to find a way to live in much more harmony with nature, and we need to find much more just societies and economies. And the thing is, we don't need to invent this. There's so many signs out there, there's so much evidence out there that alternatives don't just exist, but they've been thriving sometimes for hundreds of years. And so one of the books I published, it's called Ecocultures, is looked at cultures, we call them ecocultures, communities essentially that live in a much more harmonious way with nature and with each other, essentially. So of course there are indigenous communities, with which sometimes existed for thousands of years, but of course they've been under threat through our modern way of life and the expansion of our system, as it were. But there are also what are called new intentional communities that emerged in the so-called first world. In this country, for example, there are many eco-villages around. Many years ago, I visited Wales. There's a community called Llamas there, who were given the right by the Welsh government to build their houses on agricultural land, which would normally not be possible, but because they agreed to make a living from the land. So these are intentional new communities that sometimes been in existence for decades, and they've shown that an alternative, different way of running societies and economies is possible.
So that's a fascinating thought, really, because the concept of community, we when we think glibly of communities, we think of our town, or we think of our city, or we might think of a more social grouping, which might be, I don't know, Facebook is a community. They aren't real communities, are they? Because a real community would act in harmony with each other. Is growth our problem? Is the fact that we just permanently want to grow bigger, faster, older, and is that the problem that we're doing in all of these areas, social, economic, and environmental?
Well, growth in itself is not the enemy. Growth, it depends what kind of growth. So personal growth is another form of growth.
It is.
Community growth is another form of growth. I'm co-running a project here in Cornwall called Tevi. Tevi in Cornish means growth.
Yeah.
And what we're actually after is environmental growth, and we're using circular economy mechanisms to bring about environmental growth, which is the council's strategy to essentially regenerate and rejuvenate natural ecosystems in Cornwall, because we've done unfortunately very well in trashing the place through a whole range of extractive industries over centuries. So we need to regrow. We need to have a net positive impact on the environment now, because we've basically done damage for sometimes hundreds of years. So growth itself is not a problem, but if growth means simply economic growth, and particularly GDP growth, because that's a very, what we call growth, and everybody talks about growth, and what they really mean is GDP growth. It's that acronym, gross domestic product. It's a particular way of measurement which is very narrow. It's like going through life in this kind of way. You only see what you want to see: GDP, and you forget about everything else. The social dimensions, the wider economic dimensions, other than GDP, and the ecological impacts you're creating. So I would argue for a new way of defining GDP. We desperately need new measures to define success.
Yeah.
And so that would be my answer to the question of growth. We really need the treasury, those with the purse strings in government. They really need to look at other measures than just GDP and other narrow measures, and that's quite urgent now, which has become clear again in the pandemic.
So as much as it takes a mindset change with a community to perhaps like the community in Wales to become self-sustaining, there's a mindset change needed at a political level. Is that what you're saying?
No, absolutely. So I tend to see things from the bottom up as well as from the top down. So we need both. We need sort of the local thinking as well as the global thinking.
Yeah.
Locally, it's really important that we think in terms of place-based approaches to do our business. Just this morning, I was writing a paper on place-based corporate sustainability approaches, right? So we've been talking about sustainability within the business sector for donkey's years.
Yep.
But what I was writing in that paper together with the Exeter colleague, what we are arguing is that we need actually embed this sustainability thinking in a particular place. So what we do here in Cornwall will be very different to what people do in Texas. What people do in Texas will be very different to what people do in the Mapuche area of southern Chile, et cetera, et cetera. So place is really important, because place is important for that triple bottom line thinking, because ecosystems are unique, social systems are unique, and the way we do business and the way we earn our livelihoods will be very different depending on the different economic, social, historical settings, as well as the ecosystem that we are embedded in, right? So, whether we are placed in a desert, in a very arid area, or whether we're in a lush area of Dartmoor is very, very different. So we need to really think in these kind of place-based dimensions. But of course, you talked about politics and the mindset there. So what happens in Whitehall in this country, of course, matters. The laws matters. Who's in charge matters. So we need enabling frameworks. We need policies that enable local communities to thrive, to give local producers of food access to supply chains. We need, so the NHS, has been doing a fantastic job throughout the pandemic, but but the food we are served in NHS hospitals is supplied by global corporations, while the local producer down the road has no chance of supplying the local hospital because it doesn't have the capabilities to bring their produce into that very complex supply chain. So there's structural issues that only governments can solve. Whether we have local, well-intended communities, is kind of neither here nor there. So we kind of need both, and that's what I'm always trying to do and think through and do in practice as well.
Yeah, I mean, straddling society against the business organisation, I suppose it's politics that tends to sit in the middle there, isn't it? That straddles those two worlds of trying to get the business community to do what's right for the people, and what we're now needing more and more is the planet as well. Looking at business, then, you used a phrase about positive impact, positive climate impact, I think it was. There's lots of stuff about being high impact or low impact or no impact or net zero or carbon neutral. What's your, I mean, this is a very broad statement, but let's take net zero as an example. What's your feelings behind net zero as a target?
Well, two things. I think it's great that now everybody is thinking about climate change again. There was a lull of 6, 7, 8 years where climate change didn't really feature very much.
Yep.
And now, for the last 2 or so years, because of the activism showed by David Attenborough, by Greta Thunberg, and many others, we are now talking about it, and we are pushing companies, countries, communities, we're pushing people to really bring that back into their consciousness and really do something about it. So that's a good thing. Mm-hmm. I have to say net zero is potentially problematic, because some of these net zero pledges sometimes basically make promises that can't be defined and made very clear, because these promises sometimes reach 20, 30 years into the future. Yeah. So whoever makes a promise of what's happening in 30 years from now, i.e. net zero by 2050, without actually putting a mandatory, clear policy in place of how we reach that, is kind of not really credible. No. So lots of big companies have come out to pledge net zero emissions. As I said, it's great that they're now talking about climate change again, but often we don't have the details. The small print is simply not available. And often these pledges depend on technologies that have either been proven not to work. For example, carbon capture and storage. The industry has been talking for at least 20 years, I'm aware, has been talking about CCS, carbon capture and storage. And around the world, we haven't really got large-scale evidence that this is actually working without massive subsidies by governments. Or it's dependent on technology that hasn't been invented yet, right? So Microsoft, just at the start of the pandemic last year, made this huge pledge. We're going to be they didn't actually say net zero. They said we're going to be carbon negative, and they wanted to basically take carbon out of the atmosphere, not just future carbon, i.e. what they're emitting from now on, but all the carbon that they've emitted since they were launched in the mid-1970s. So big pledge. But it was all based on technology that doesn't exist yet. So that's not really credible. And so we need credible plans, really. And the net is really, really important. And that's where my interest of carbon offsetting comes in. Unfortunately, a lot of the net in the net zero basically means that we will see a huge uptake in carbon offsetting strategies.
Yeah.
Because, and Carney, the former Bank of England governor, he's kind of championing that carbon offsetting, carbon market approach. He's kind of formed a all singing and dancing task force to kind of push the carbon market agenda, and basically saying, voluntary carbon offsets will be, a multi-billion pound opportunity, business opportunity, and he's really trying to push that forward. And what I've done, amongst many other colleagues, academics, and others, over the last, 15, 20 years really, basically collated evidence, analyzed evidence of looking at how these carbon offsetting projects actually work. And unfortunately, the site is not always pretty, because these carbon offsetting projects are not always, delivering the goods, and not always really lowering our overall carbon emissions. It's a complicated story to tell, because it's really down to the nitty-gritty, looking at what's happening on the ground, because a lot of these carbon offsets work by, a company in the global north, putting £1 million into a project that they might have never visited on the other side of the world. And so there's this huge distance often between the people who emit the carbon and those who are supposed to offset the carbon. And, all sorts of fraud, all sorts of creative accounting is happening in the process, in that distance, which has kept us and will keep us busy in terms of analyzing this from an academic point of view for years to come. But there's a book I published on that more than 10 years ago now, called Upsetting the Offset, which kind of is an introduction to that debate.
Yeah, I mean, I saw that one, and I think it was a great quote from Stefano Hani about that book. It said, "If you wondered whether capitalism could ever produce the perfect weapon of its own destruction, try this heady mix of carbon fuels, the trade in financial derivatives, and more than a dash of neo-colonialism, and boom." And it's a great, great. Basically, we're heading off down a road of offsetting and putting. There was a lot of people. It's all about the offsetting. I'll offset everything. I'll buy, £12 a year or £12 a month on trees, and that offset all my flying for the rest of my life. Or, and is it realistic? And I think it's a fascinating subject. You're right. I wouldn't want to say that there is no way to offset using trees for the future, but a poorly managed scheme will see, 1 million trees halved in 10 years because they died due to mismanagement, or a poor mix of ecocultures, or
as in many areas of life, it's all down to the governance and how things are shaped and controlled and monitored, and who has a say in these things. So carbon offsetting itself is not evil, but the way it is managed, the way it is done, the way it's monitored, the way the carbon is accounted, who wins and who loses out. So there are all these kind of nitty-gritty details that let many of these schemes down. I mean, there are some brilliant ideas of some really localized community place-based offsetting schemes, which could work quite well, because you don't have that distance. You can talk to people living in the same place, and you can do some really good stuff in a place-based approach. But unfortunately, that's not often what is happening, and what Carney's task force has in mind. So
yeah. Well, I mean, Mark Carney, you mentioned there that kind of, and I know we're doing a whistle-stop tour of a whack load of subjects here. Maybe we'll have to revisit some of them at some point. But carbon trading is a difficult thing to get your head round. I mean, it's a tall order for you. Can you give us a simple appraisal of what carbon trading actually is and why perhaps a business would need to look at it?
Sure, sure. I mean, yeah, I mean, I teach, I teach 2 hours of just on carbon trading to my students. So just to tell you the yeah, give you an overview in 2 minutes is really a tall order.
Yeah.
But yeah, in a nutshell is, I mean, there are some basically there are voluntary schemes and there are mandatory schemes. So until recently, we were part of the EU, of course, and the EU is running the biggest emissions trading system, ETS, of the world. And that's a mandatory system. So there are laws in place where if you have a certain size, if you run a power station or you are a big steel works, you need to be part of that trading system.
Mm.
And what the governments and the EU in this case, the Commission basically sets is a so-called cap. It's also called a cap and trade system. So the EU basically says, okay, here's a cap of whatever it is, call it 100 tons of CO2. That's what you're allowed to emit.
Yeah.
Anything above it, if you emit more, then essentially you need to buy carbon permits, which basically costs you real money, and you need to buy it on the open carbon market. And yeah, that's your mandatory requirement to essentially then buy these permits because you're emitted more than you're allowed to. If you're under that cap, then you can sell permits, you can make money. So that's the idea, is that you're then incentivized to essentially lower your emissions because you have this money incentive of selling permits. This only works if the cap is set at the right level. So for many years, through lobbying and genuine concerns for livelihoods and basically industry flight overseas, the cap was not set in the right way. So essentially the carbon price, so basically the higher the cap, the lower the carbon price, the lower the cap, the higher the carbon price, right?
Yeah.
So the carbon price for many, many years was far too low for being, for being a transformational kind of incentive, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the mandatory carbon trading system. And for that, you need strong political leadership to work. You need, the Paris Climate Agreement to work, and not just being essentially nice words, but actually actual real legal requirements for countries to lower their emissions. But on top of that, you then have voluntary systems where basically through CSR, corporate social responsibility, or essentially a CEO or managers wanting to do the right thing, and they want to tell their customers, okay, when you buy this product or you take this flight with us, you don't emit any carbon. So EasyJet, for example, aviation was until recently not part of the EU ETS. So EasyJet, just before the pandemic, brought in a voluntary scheme where they said, if you take any flight with us, your carbon emissions will be offset, right? So that's a voluntary scheme, and then they basically take their money and invest it in offsetting projects. So that's a voluntary scheme. That's basically CSR. That's what they want to do. And these systems have always existed side by side. And often the voluntary ones are, of course, less monitored. Sometimes there've been very, very few standards. Anybody can offer an offset, as it were. The mandatory EU or UN controlled systems, of course, are more stringent and more monitored.
Oh, interesting. I mean, you talk about the cap being lowered and about the right position to make that a big enough incentive, one, to drop below the cap, and two, to pay as little as you can above it. The carbon price, as I've seen it, has doubled in the last 6 months. Now, I mean, is that because we're coming out of COVID and we're moving back to pre-COVID levels of carbon emissions, or is there something else at work? And suddenly, actually, that carbon price is starting to naturally level out. There was some talk that it could go as high as $100, sitting at around $51 now, I think.
Yeah, so indeed, the carbon price has increased not just over the last half year, but over the last 2 years. And again, we could talk hours about why that has happened, but essentially, it's a supply and demand thing. So there's much more demand now for carbon products, essentially, because the whole world is suddenly waking up to climate change again. There's a lot more talk about it, but not just talk, but governments are moving in the right direction. There are many more laws around, and many companies now realize we really need to do something about this. It can't just be put at the bottom of our CSR report. We really need to show our investors now that we're doing the right thing here. So in the financial jargon, it's called ESG. ESG means stands for environment, social, and governance. So it's basically all the non-economic things that are becoming ever more important. So there are many hedge funds, there are many investor funds now that are really focusing on ESG, and there's a real drive of demand for climate change related financial products, and that's part of why the price has increased. And that's a good thing. The problem is we needed that really 20 years ago or 30 years ago. I've always argued then if you run carbon markets properly, they're properly monitored, and you have a real political leadership, real political intention, then essentially they should work as a carbon tax, right? So you successfully bring down the cap that I mentioned. So each year or every 2 or 3 years, the cap goes down, and you tell everyone that's what you're doing. So actually, the price is increasing or is kept high, and everybody knows what you're talking about, and it basically acts as a carbon tax for the most carbon intensive industries. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened. So the hope is now, and the EU has recently come up with plans to include shipping, to include aviation in its ETS, and there's real new political leadership now to do something. But we've been here before. We had a lot of political leadership around climate change. I remember it well, in the run-up to the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference in 2009. So in the period between 2004 and 2009, in these 5 years, everybody was talking about climate change. BP changed its name to Beyond Petroleum during that time, because it was so important to show that they're moving beyond petroleum. And we're still here, almost 20 years later, and fossil fuel is still king.
I've been thinking of a whole stack of questions out of what you just said, but I mean, again, we haven't got the length of time that we would need to talk about it all, and perhaps people need to catch up with you yourself in some of your the sessions that I know you've got planned with TEVI and other organizations. But there's this horrendous balance, isn't it? You put carbon tax on people, you put it on things like petroleum, like aviation fuel, you end up moving that tax will have to be offset by the price rise to the consumers. Consumer won't be able to travel as much, they won't be owning their own car, they'll be forced to drive or buy a more economical car, which might cost more because you're taxing mining. It's such a complex game, isn't it? I can see why that bar couldn't move too often. You mentioned earlier about Greta Thunberg and David Attenborough as probably two of the more visible media-based activists, and we we know there are perhaps the more extreme bodies of activism like Extinction Rebellion, Greenpeace, maybe, who take some very, very, very severe actions, and corporate activism is on the rise. Is that what we should all be? Should we all be activists? Should all businesses be activists, or is there no room for that?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of climate activism out there, everywhere. So I've got a book coming out with a Swedish colleague of mine, and where we argue precisely that, that activism, climate activism, is happening in all spheres of society and in all spheres of business. So we've done interviews and analyses in big companies, big utilities, in smaller companies, in communities, in state governmental organizations like local councils, and we've mapped the climate activism in all of these spheres, and it was really a positive story that we were quite surprised to find that level of activism, and really outspoken people who really say, okay, we really need to change our way of doing things. Business as usual is not an option anymore, and we really need to not just change our way, but we need to have a radical change. They were really radical in their thinking and in their action as well. So, and of course, companies have come out as activists as well. CEOs have come out as climate activists. Larry Fink, for example, he's the CEO of BlackRock. He's one of the big fund managers in the US. He's warning its investors as well as the companies he's invested in, every year, and saying, we need to take climate change and the big ecological dimensions of life very, very seriously. And if you're on the wrong side of the debate, think again, because you'll be a dinosaur in due course. So lots of signs in that direction. But of course, the story is a more complicated one. Not all activist talk is activist action. Mm-hmm. So sometimes activist talk is used for corporate relations purposes. Sometimes it's used for marketing purposes, building a brand. There are a lot of brands out there who want that kind of radical chic kind of edge to it, because they want to talk to the young generation, right? So if you talk to the young generation, you need to sound different. You need to sound resistant. You need to sound different, and that's what some of these emerging brands are doing, and many of them are trying to underpin that by real action. But of course, they're finding it hard to doing the right thing if they need to make not just profits, but actually having a profit curve that goes up, right? Because that's what the system and what's the stock market often demanding. It's kind of exponential growth, growth in profits and revenues. So it's that sort of underlying system that gets in the way of us doing the right thing. I think many people instinctively want to do the right thing, and that instinct, that culture came through so very, very clearly in the pandemic, where lots of people felt, and we're in this together, we're in a community, let's help each other out. And in moments of crisis, the community spirit often comes through. But then, the rebound has started already, and I'm sure, for example, sticking with carbon, unfortunately, carbon emissions will see a rebound quite dramatically. Of course they will. Because we are celebrating things like Jeff Bezos going into low orbit yesterday with this massive fossil fuel thing.
Yeah, if we made it into space on electric, we might love him a bit more, mightn't we? Yeah, I mean, let's not get into the race for space, isn't it? We've done enough. You always get the feeling that they've damaged the world enough. So let's spend all our money on getting out of here.
There's that cynical view, unfortunately. You know, as we wreck our Earth, and there are less things we can explore and discover on our Earth because we have turned it upside down already. You know, let's just explore and wreck other places. I mean, that's a cynical view. Of course, there's important science that space has given us, and they're genuine, humane, and important purposes for going to space. But space tourism, I don't think is part of that.
Tend to agree. Now, in your last comment, you did circle back round to the fact that capitalism actually, to a certain extent, the seeking for profit and those exponential growths of profit is what tends to draw the eye of the CEO, especially of the bigger businesses who are trying to serve their shareholders and give them their biggest dividend or biggest return. You may be aware of it, the Better Business Act campaign that's going on at the moment, which is looking to change section 172 of the Companies Act to put in some legal principles to empower directors to advance the interests of all stakeholders, not just the shareholders. Is that the kind of change that business needs to make, or is there other stuff that we should be looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a great bottom-up kind of activist campaign where B Corps and other activists, would like to see positive change. And as I said, the pandemic has really galvanized views around that, and really many people want to build back better, as the saying goes, and that's a good thing. And the B Corps, I've met many B Corps here in Cornwall. Fantastic people wanting to do the right thing, and having a change of legislation is a good thing. I think it's one approach. One can be a little bit critical about the B Corp approach in as far as that sometimes it's a paper-based kind of tick box exercise where you kind of you pledge your things and you do your analysis and you're driven in the right direction, but in the end it's a kind of a nice thing to have incremental approach, which is great, and I think it's good to have that. And if we can scale that out and really build a movement of corporate activists in that way, then that's great. That's great. And some bigger companies are now listening and wanting to do the right thing. But I think what and change comes from the bottom up. Yeah. And I hope that change can really bring about more radical action in the long term. So, but the underlying pressures of producing exponential growth rates are still in place, and these are global ones, and they're enshrined in all sorts of global treaties. If you just look at the WTO, for example, in terms of trading rules, it's very, very difficult for any country to kind of really have a different way of if you're part of the WTO, you're part of a global trading system which allows you to do certain things and only those things. And if you're going against that, then you take to court essentially. So there are global things in place that would need changing as well. But bringing about change is a complex thing, and it's sometimes a matter of one step forward and two steps back. Sometimes you have a radical flank that does one thing, and then you have a more mainstream kind of activist crowd that is moving more slowly. And it's not a linear process, and I'm quite hopeful that we can see positive change, because what I see on a daily basis is that people really want change, and people
Yeah.
completely realize that we can't just go on like we have, along these kind of triple bottom line areas. It's not just a question of climate change, because climate change, I'm sure capitalism can solve climate change. I'm pretty sure of that. The problem is climate change is not an isolated thing. It is connected to an ecological emergency. We have a massive biodiversity species decline. We have multiple ecological dimensions that we are failing on. So climate change is just really one aspect, and we mustn't forget that. And we haven't even talked about the social emergencies. Of those, the inequalities between those who have and those who don't, ever getting wider.
Yeah, we're in danger of the dollar having ruled the ruled the nest, ruled the world for a while. It's not all about the CO2. Just moving the CO2 is not enough. We've got mining, we've got logging, as you said, any of the biodiversity issues and the loss of a million species that are at risk at the moment. So yeah, I can see that. It's so important that we don't just jump on that one other bandwagon. One other question that I've got to ask is, what's academia's role in all of this? Obviously we think about it educating the young, and obviously it doesn't just educate the young, it educates anybody who gets involved. But what do you think academia has to offer to the business, especially?
Thought leadership. So I think that's really important. Knowledge, information, data, and not just publish good papers in international, excellent journals, but actually translate this knowledge into information and knowledge that can be used by local and local communities, by local businesses, as well as global businesses. So making that knowledge accessible. So the way we publish, the way we engage, conversations like this are really important for me, because I can write another academic article, another academic book that 10 people or 15 read, hopefully a bit more, but in the end, it's about engagement.
Yes.
And I think that's really, really important. And the University of Exeter is taking that really, seriously. We had recently a new vice chancellor coming in, and for whom the place-based engagement approach is really, really important, and that's really speaks to my heart, and is something that I've always tried to practice, which is not always easy, because it's time intensive, and sometimes you have a barrier of a practice approach and a theory approach. Sometimes the two don't necessarily always mingle easily in the middle.
Yeah, and that's always kind of the balance. You talk to an academic that hasn't run a business or been involved in a business is a different academic to one that has.
Just one last thought. I mean, I've been playing an active role in the university in its own institutional efforts to combat climate change and to combat the triple bottom line, the donut, as it were, sometimes called donut economics nowadays. The universities as a whole across the country are often very important what I call anchor organizations, big public institutions who should and need to lead the way. So the way we procure our food, the way we fly or not fly around the world, the way we show leadership in what we do really, really matters.
Yeah.
So we've become much more aware of that as an institution, and really want to play a leader role in that, and basically bring our own house in order, as it were.
Okay. Well, that's been a brilliant chat. I have got a few other things I just want to run past you, if we can. I asked you if you had a tip or an action that we could take, either as business or as personal, that you would share. What would you like to see people do as an action?
It's a very personal thing. I think work in front of the computer, I think, most days, and sometimes too much computer screen-based work and too much thinking is not good for thinking. We need a break. We need to go on holiday, but on a daily basis, we need to get our hands dirty. We need to engage with the places, with the communities, with where we live and work. So that's been really important for me, not just throughout the pandemic, but been trying to practice that for many years to essentially go out and garden. We've started we call it a veg project. Where we do veg gardening together with other families, and bring the kids, introduce kids to gardening and veg growing, for example. So the supermarket global culture of food, for example, sometimes it's taking us away from understanding where food comes from, and it's that place-based approach which is really important. So I think, that can be all sorts of, can be done in all sorts of ways, and I just used food as an example, but engaging with a place, getting your hands dirty, doing some woodwork has been really important for me.
Yeah, I like that. Living in a small community myself, it's been actually, to a certain extent, a revelation. The COVID effect was a positive one to a certain extent, but obviously it has its negative sides. Now, you mentioned you got a couple of publications coming out. A book you're writing with a Swedish colleague, you mentioned. So when are we likely to see that?
That book with the Swedish colleague is probably not coming out till next year now.
Okay.
It's taking taking a while, but I've got another book coming out, hopefully published in the next month or so, in the run-up to this all-important Glasgow conference on climate change, for the nerds, COP26. And it's a big UN run, hosted by the UK government, UN-run climate change conference, where basically the countries around the world come together to decide what to do about climate change. So we've got another book coming out, which basically brings together social scientists from around the world and really trying to answer the question, why after 30 years of climate change negotiations, longer now, why we're still talking about climate change, and why are emissions still rising, if we don't happen to have a global pandemic. So we haven't changed, we haven't changed the system. The system is currently heading towards climate catastrophe. Wow. And so social scientists have a particular take on this, and what the book is trying to do is basically bring these views together and kind of intervene in these negotiations happening in Glasgow, and ask a few pertinent but important questions.
Okay, well, we can look forward to that. Is there anything else you would recommend somebody sticks their head into or watches, or what would you recommend people read, watch?
Well, to continue the food theme, if I have spare time and still have eyes open enough to watch more stuff online, or have more screen-based activity, I sometimes really like looking at permaculture videos, many of which are online on
Yeah.
YouTube, etc. And you know, there's so much material on YouTube, and kind of people trying to, you know, not just trying, but really perfect examples of how you can grow food differently. You know, we live in the Southwest, and you know, we are very used to grass-fed cows and sheep, and mostly the fields being used for that kind of purpose. And it's such an inefficient way of producing food, I have to say. I mean, we've become really used to it. But you know, we can do so much more and so much better with our fantastic climate here in the Southwest. And
Yes.
you know, we can, you know, there are all sorts of agroecological, agroforestry, permaculture kind of ways of producing so much more food on sometimes very small plots of land. And I get inspired about what people do around the world, and I stick a video on YouTube, and sometimes they have hundreds of thousands of views. So there's so many alternatives out there. So I get inspired by that.
Okay. Well, I'll dig out a few and bung those on the show page as an example. Thanks for that. Now, hopefully you've got a few moments so that we can just run through some fact or fakes. Are you up for this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, so I'll give you a statement. It might be a fact. It might be a modified fact. It might be a fake. You decide. There are 92 countries with national carbon emissions trading schemes, and China will start trading on theirs in late 2021. Is that a fact or a fake? 92
Both.
countries.
I think it's a bit of both. I'm not sure. I think it's a fact that many are planning to start them, and some of them have been planning to do this for many years. I'm not sure about the exact number. 92 sounds a little bit on the high side, but I know it's growing, and I know it's many countries have plans like that. But we have very few who actually have started. So I would say not a fact.
Not, not a fact. It's a very nice way of saying fake, and you're right. There are 45 countries, so I doubled it and a bit with national car about 945. And China started trading on theirs this week or last week, and that I think has just because of just the size of China is about to surpass the European one that you mentioned is currently the leading carbon trading scheme. But what's interesting one, China's scheme is different from those operating in the European Union, is it's chosen to focus on reducing the intensity of emissions generation rather than absolute emissions. So what one to watch, I suppose, as to whether that's a reasonable focus or not.
Well, they decided to start with the most, you know, with the power generation with the most carbon intensive industries, which you know, which is exactly where the EU started initially as well. So it's probably wise to start there, but yeah, if it takes another 20 years to bring any emissions reductions, then you know we have failed.
Yes. Okay, number two, filmmaker Richard Curtis has launched a campaign called Make My Money Matter with a Green Pensions Charter, which now has 63 signatories. That's just a bit of context. UK pension schemes manage 1.3 trillion in funds. Is that a fact or a fake?
Yeah, fact.
Fact. That's actually a fake. It's not 1.3 trillion, it's 2.6 trillion. So in terms of, you know, the power of the pension, the MMMM, Make My Money Matter, it just intrigued me that Richard Curtis was the one that launched it. But he's allowed to have good ideas in all sorts of areas. And also reported on July 21st that there were 11 new joiners, including Tesco's and Travis Perkins. And another fact, these are all fact, I'm throwing them at you just because I thought they were brilliant. Greening your pension is 21 times more impactful at cutting your carbon prove that to me, it would be a question. Then going veggie, stopping flying and switching to a green energy provider combined.
That I'd like to see those calculations,
And
but it's true.
Maybe that's one for us to throw at the academics to work through.
Yeah, and that's a difficult calculation to make, because of course, the pensions invest their money in the companies that are then having scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions, and involving consumers, etc., etc. So it's a difficult calculation to make, but well, it's true that pensions money really matters, absolutely. I've had my pension money in green outlets for a long time, but what is sometimes green, and I've just recently got very interested in ESG financial kind of indices, and what is marked as green in terms of a share that is seen as having good ESG credentials.
Yeah.
Again, these categorizations, these accounting mechanisms need to be unpacked themselves, right?
And proven. Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. But the power of the pound is an interesting, because we talked about the capitalism system, and innovation and capitalism is based on investors. Now, if investors are going to start only investing very, very large funds like pension funds hold in greener, more sustainable technologies, or industries that have got better sustainable credentials, what are those credentials is another thing. But that could be quite a powerful thing, and you can moving your pension around could change the thought of investors. But
absolutely, yeah.
But dear investor, you've got to expect a slower return, because massive growth is not sustainable, really.
Well, that's the thing. In just my lifetime, I did actually do a bank apprenticeship. I learned banking from the bottom up, as it were. So I worked 3 years in banking, and that was in the early 1990s. And in that short historical time, the expectations of shareholders have risen massively in terms of the returns they're expecting.
Yeah.
So these expectations of what are viable returns on investment they change all the time, and have increased massively just over the last 30 odd years.
Yeah.
It's that. So we're not just talking about growth, we're talking about exponential growth. So we're expecting the likes of Amazon, not the rainforest, but the company. We expect them to grow into monumental, big, multi-billion pound companies, and so that's a normal expectation now, which in historical terms is completely ludicrous.
Yeah.
It's this kind of growth. As I said, growth in itself is not a problem. It's exponential growth, what we have become accustomed to, that is the problem. And we really need to start thinking about prosperity. We need to think about well-being. We need to think about, what do we actually need to live well? Do we need that exponential growth? And where is that growth and that wealth actually going? Is it going into space tourism?
Yes, it appears it. Last thing, I don't know, sitting on TV and watching a billionaire shoot himself to the edge of space is just a waste of money. But hey, okay then, one each we're at. So this is the decider. The Sengwer people of Mbobut Forest in Kenya were violently forced from their homes and dispossessed of their ancestral lands as part of a government plan to reduce deforestation. Is that a fact or a fake?
I don't know the details of that, but it rings true. The Upsetting the Offset book and other studies that I mentioned before have shown that unfortunately, carbon offsetting schemes or other well-intended schemes, to avoid deforestation, the so-called RED Plus schemes, unfortunately, sometimes mean that indigenous people are being evicted because now these forests become property of some foreign owners, and you can't have people living on your property unless unless they're guarding the fences, unfortunately. So it's one of these trade-offs, some of these weird unintended consequences where environmental credentials sometimes sit very uncomfortably next to social justice issues. So I stick my head out. I think that's a fact, although I don't know the details of that.
You called it correctly. Yes, you're right. Amnesty International reported that they removed, never consented to it, never were consulted about it, and they violated both Kenyan and international law in doing it. But and of course, they're probably one of those very communities that we talked about earlier on, which were self-sustaining. They lived in their indigenous lands, and that served them to live. And yet we turn them out so that we can reduce deforestation, the impact of the global north on the global south, predominantly.
Yeah. No, it's a travesty. It's one of these dynamics that are unfortunately on the increase because of climate change, unintentionally. But that's unfortunately what is happening around the world. And part of my mission is to map this, but also for talking about these things so that people who pay for their carbon offsetting or well intentionally trying to do something about climate change, so they know what actually happens with their money, because unfortunately it's a story that's not enough publicized.
Yes, the carbon, I don't think that illustrated better the carbon justice movement that also is, again, you said at the very beginning, it's a balance between all of those different things. So it just leaves me you one fact or fake. So congratulations on that. I'll take that very nobly. And I'd just like to thank you, Steffen, for joining us on the Green Elephant Show.
Great. Thanks, Russell. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
We really hope that you found this insight into another Better Business both informative and entertaining. So make sure you don't miss any of our other chats with other Better Businesses by subscribing to our podcast, available on all good providers, or on the Green Elephant YouTube channel. And please don't forget to spread the word with others. If you have any questions, comments or suggestions on the show, please do get in touch. You can email us studio@greenelephant.show or visit our website greenelephant.show or find us across social @greenelipod. Join us next time, and we hope you have a sustainable week.